years ago and watched the NCAA virtually do nothing. Now we see a basketball player, a premier basketball player, come out and say that he never had to go to class, that he was given 4 A's in the African American Studies program without ever having attended a class in order to stay eligible the year they won the national championship in 04-05. Mary Willingham, who was a learning specialist at North Carolina, described as the whistleblower on the academic fraud scandal, was excoriated by the people at North Carolina. The NCAA, I guess, paid no attention to her, and yet somehow came to the conclusion that Penn State, with an impeccable academic record, was somehow allowing football to take over academics.
Well, you said a lot there, and there's a lot to be said in comparison between these two cases. I watched the Outside the Lines on ESPN. And
today I did too.
And one of the things I found to be most remarkable was at the end, they had a statement from the NCAA saying that it's up to the school to determine issues of academic eligibility. And I thought, okay, that's interesting and fine, but is it not also up to the criminal justice system to determine issues of criminality that have nothing to do with either academics or athletics, which is what the NCAA did with regard to Penn State, and the most nonsensical issuing of sanctions in the history of the organization by far. And by the way, that's even if you believe everything the media narrative tells us is true, which I don't, and I don't think you do either.
Nope.
So even if you accept everything as true, this mythology that was created at Penn State, what the NCAA did was utterly absurd. Now, there are a couple other interesting comparisons, I think, Kevin, with the North Carolina situation. One of them is, of course, the definition of a cover-up. I always found this fascinating. Ever since the Penn State allegation of a cover-up, I've always been looking at other situations where they unravel, right, where these actual real cover-ups unravel. Maybe the most amazing example is the Lance Armstrong cover-up. When that unraveled, boy, did it unravel. I mean, there was zero doubt, right? I mean, there's all sorts of evidence that Armstrong had been running this cover-up for a very long time. Everyone was in on it. It cost millions of dollars to sustain. It had all sorts of people involved. And when it collapsed big time. Well, I find it very interesting that where's the McCants from the Penn State story with regard to a cover-up? I mean, are you telling me that nobody at Penn State, even with all the media glory they would get, is willing to come forward and say, yep, there was a cover-up. We all knew Sandusky was a pedophile, and Paterno knew, and we were afraid of the bad publicity. Why has no one said that? No, I mean, and even Mike McQueary, the only witness in the case, has said the exact opposite of that. And in fact, it's even more amazing is there are 3 people with their livelihoods, their freedoms currently on the line because they're facing very serious charges that could result in prison time, who would have an incentive to flip on each other if there was a real cover-up.
Right.
But that hasn't happened either. Yep. Because why? There was no cover-up. But here we have McCants coming forward in what I think is a very credible fashion, although I think a couple of his allegations are being a little bit oversold by ESPN. Maybe we can get into that later. But the reality is this is the exact kind of guy who comes forward after his career is over, his professional basketball career is basically over, his association with North Carolina is over, so he comes forward and tells the truth in a very credible fashion. That's a cover-up, and that's how a real cover-up disintegrates once it disintegrates, further proving, in my view, that there was no cover-up at Penn State because there's no similar person coming forward to claim they now, what they knew all along, what Penn State knew all along, what Joe Paterno knew all along, which, of course, in the case of Penn State was absolutely nothing, I believe, largely because there was very little of anything to know. So there are amazing correlations between the two. I'm curious what you think about all that.
I think there are spectacular correlations here, and that's a great way to describe the cover-up and lack of cover-up at Penn State. And in McCant's case, he's not some guy that had an axe to grind. He was a star player who was the 14th overall pick in the NBA the year he came out after his junior year. He won a national championship with North Carolina. So if anybody's not going to ever tarnish the great North Carolina image, it would be a guy of his record and his resume. But here he is, as you said, and I believe too, very credible in the things he's saying because the details are right there. The transcript that he had is right there. And that Roy Williams, similar in North Carolina to Joe Paterno at Penn State, All he has to do is say, well, I never knew of anything like this, and I think that's unfair to me and the university, and everybody just goes away.
Well, the difference in the two cases, the biggest difference is going to be the media coverage. Now, ESPN does this 30 for 30 today. They asked Roy Williams to come on to comment. Apparently, at first, his people said, yes, he'll come on, and then he canceled,
right?
Which is very interesting. And what I believe will happen is that nothing will occur because the circumstances are vastly different surrounding this case than what happened at Penn State, and they were almost all logistical and media-oriented. And what I mean by that is, and there are people who are Penn State and Joe Paterno supporters who to this day don't fully understand what I mean when I say this. The perfect storm that was the Penn State Sandusky case does not exist in North Carolina. And here's why. First of all, as big a deal as Roy Williams is, he's not Joe Paterno.
No, he's not.
Okay, that's number one. Number two, Paterno had just broken the all-time wins record for coaching. And he was coaching the last home game of the year that Saturday after Sandusky gets indicted. ESPN was carrying the game. Okay, so on Monday, ESPN goes 24/7, balls to the wall, all in, literally on his front doorstep on this story. The Penn State Board of Trustees panics at the fear of having this nationally televised pep rally for a so-called pedophile protector, which is what would have happened had Joe Paterno not been fired that week. And by the way, I think it would have been a rightfully, an absolute, perfectly appropriate pep rally for Joe Paterno, given the actual reality and circumstances and the truth of the case. But obviously, in perception, that would not have been the case. So they were terrified of this, and that, I believe, is what fueled the pressure to panic and fire the president of the university, fire Joe Paterno, and everything else has flowed directly in a domino effect from that massive panic attack that the Penn State Board of Trustees had. Well, none of that is in existence here in North Carolina.
And yet
what's going to happen is that this story will be reported locally for a little while. There may be a couple more stories on it. Maybe ESPN will follow up at some point. But that will be it, because we now live in a world where, because of media fragmentation, it's not what gets reported that's important, Kevin. It's what gets repeated. And when Penn State, it got repeated and repeated and repeated for 24/7 for that full week. In this case, that's not going to happen because the same circumstances are not in play.
I love that slogan. It's not what's reported, it's what's repeated. And yet not a morsel of evidence in the Penn State situation to have ever justified any of the actions that were taking place, either by the Board of Trustees at Penn State or by the NCAA. And here in this case, we have factual evidence. We have McCants coming forward and saying that he and not just him, by the way, other basketball players, especially basketball players, taking these African-American studies classes. Here's the contrast in McCant's academic career at North Carolina. In the classes where he was not enrolled in African-American studies, he had 6 C's, 1 D, and 3 F's. In the African-American studies classes, 10 A's, 6 B's. I mean, that's when he had to become eligible.
Now, Kevin, what you just put your finger on there is absolutely the heart of this scandal. But I want to take it one step further, and knowing you as well as I do, I think you're going to agree with me on this. I actually think the biggest human scandal in all of this, what the liberal media elites, if they were remotely consistent and not hypocrites, would be all over in this, is think about this. The African American Studies Department at the University of North Carolina was used willingly, unless McCants is totally lying, willingly to keep black basketball players academically enslaved, for all intents and purposes, to the University of North Carolina for the purposes of them making millions of dollars off of their sweat. Now, with the ultimate, you can't even can't even describe the irony there because, of course, African American studies is largely based in the concept of the history of slavery in this country. Well, here's the African American Studies Department in North Carolina being used to promote modern virtual slavery. Am I right?
You're exactly right. And that's what he said. That's what McCann said, is that we're not here to go to class or to get an education. We're here to bring in revenue for the university and to bring prestige to the university. Well, there's the enslavement.
Yeah, but of course, you want to take it further. I mean, I've been to many North Carolina basketball games. I covered them in the D-Myth era. I mean, by and large, it's basically rich white people watching, 8 or 9 black guys playing basketball. I mean,
that's about what it is.
I mean, I went to Georgetown. Georgetown's exactly the same way. So, I mean, if you just the optics of it are exceedingly ironic, given the notion of African American studies and the entire foundation of that system of study. So, I mean, from a purely human, forget about the sports aspect, that is to me the most amazing part of this scandal. And then as far as the sports angle, though, I want to be consistent here with, not rushing to judgment. I actually don't know that what he says about Roy Williams is necessarily proof that Roy Williams was part of a cover-up. Now, I'm not naive. I know that Roy Williams was well aware of what was going on. But what he quotes Roy Williams is saying is really not that bad. I don't know how carefully you listen to that. But, he basically, it seems to me like this was more of a wink, wink, nod, nod type of thing rather than an overt, hey, this is what's going to happen, and that Roy Williams was protected by other people, which is the way you do a cover-up, right? I mean, this is, in a rational world, you don't let the top guy, you have to give him plausible deniability. You're not going to let him, being culpable for this. It seems to me as if Roy Williams said pretty much all the right things, and that proving that Roy Williams was part of this is going to be exceedingly difficult. But the reality is the reality. I mean, it's obvious that unless McCants is a pathological liar with no motive to lie, that this was systematic at North Carolina, and that the hypocrisy here is overwhelming in so many different ways.
Yeah, it's ironic, and it's almost laughable that no one accused Joe Paterno of any wrongdoing at Penn State until they fired him, and then they really didn't accuse him of any wrongdoing. And this is a player accusing Roy Williams of wrongdoing, and whether it can be proven or not, they'll have to wait and see if Roy Williams' fingerprints are on these paper classes. I would assume there'll be a real investigation, though before I assume such folly, I must slap myself silly and understand that the NCAA doesn't want to get involved. I think they're petrified after all the lawsuits from the Penn State situation, so they'll walk very quietly toward this North Carolina debacle.
Well, it's important to point out, Kevin, a lot of people don't understand, especially morons in the sports media, they don't understand how the NCAA works and where they get their money. People think that football and basketball are the same for the NCAA. The NCAA has almost no access to football money. All their money comes from basketball. The NCAA basketball tournament is what funds the NCAA for all intents and purposes. North Carolina is one of their stars. Roy Williams is one of their stars. I mean, they have a much larger financial incentive to not destroy North Carolina than they do Penn State football, because they weren't making any money from Penn State football. In fact, in the Penn State situation, I believe they were using the hurricane winds that the media created for them at their back to finally show that they weren't impotent, because this was a situation they knew they could do whatever they wanted and look strong, and the media was going to get out their pom-poms for them. And that's exactly what happened. We're not going to see that with North Carolina.
John Ziegler, our guest from FramingPaterno.com. And, John, one of the latest entries on FramingPaterno.com is a list of questions that you've come up with that the media will never ask and that they'll remain unanswered. And one of them that stands out to me, I mean, they all do because they're all very well thought out, but this one is the real basis for any of this. Ask someone, which accuser do you believe and why do you believe them?
I'm glad you mentioned that, Kevin, because I've not been able to find anybody who can answer that question. I mean, and I ask it all the time.
Right,
I mean, I ask I mean, because I constantly get the, oh my God, you're an insane person for believing that Jerry Sandusky might not be guilty. And for the record, for people who don't know, I started all this quest 2.5 years ago, presuming like everybody else that Sandusky was guilty as hell. Then as I interviewed him twice in prison and got to know his wife, Dottie, exceedingly well, and went on the Today Show twice, and once with her, and all the your regular listeners know all this, and you can find all the information at framingpaterno.com. But after all this, I started to wait a minute, hold on a second. This case makes no damn sense. The trial was a sham. And for those who say I'm insane, just tell me, just please explain to me, which accuser do you believe and why do you believe them? And no one will answer because there's not one accuser whose story is remotely bulletproof. And it bothers me immensely that, just from a due process standpoint, that you're not even allowed to talk about the other side of this case.
No, you're not.
I mean, literally, you're not even. You are essentially worse than Hitler if you even bring up the fact that, by the way, guys, this case was not only not proven, it is horrendous, and I actually can tell. And we're not going to do it today, but I've done it at other times. And you can see where I did do it at framingpaterno.com. I can tell a full story of this entire case involving Sandusky and Penn State, which makes a hell of a lot more sense than the other side can. A hell of a lot more sense. And I don't even think that's debatable. And one of the so-called accusers that I've been very focused on, because I think it's the entire case, is the so-called victim number 2, the Mike McQueary victim. And as you know, Kevin, I have spent probably 2 years trying to track this guy down. I finally found him. I know where he lives. I've had an investigator speak to him. I have a recording of that discussion. I believe that he has reaffirmed his original statement saying on the day Joe Paterno was fired that he was the boy in the shower and that nothing happened that night or any other night with Jerry Sandusky. And I have continued to try to pressure him in numerous ways to come forward and tell the truth. He's an ex-Marine. Dottie Sandusky told me just yesterday when we discussed this. By the way, she was in tears when I told her what I'm about to tell you about what I've learned about victim number 2. And she said that she does not believe, knowing him that the way that she does, that he will be able to maintain his silence. That he will have to come forward and eventually tell the truth of this case. I don't know how long that's going to take, but I believe the case will break open if and when that finally happens. But what I've now learned, and I've never revealed this yet, although for people who haven't followed the case, they're not going to realize the significance of it, is that I have spoken to someone who has seen the insurance record on his claim. Because victim number 2 did become a quote-unquote victim and did get money once the crap hit the fan. Well, I had always been very concerned about, okay, did this guy ever change his story? Did he ever change the story that he gave on the day Joe Paterno was fired that nothing had ever happened? Well, as the person who has looked at this file from the insurance claim that was made on his behalf says that they have not one shred of evidence from him at all. There is not one statement from him. The entire claim was based on media accounts and Mike McQueary's now highly suspect testimony. And not only do they have no new statement from him, I found this very interesting, and as a lawyer, I'd love your opinion on this, Kevin, and my interpretation of it. It turns out that this particular person got $3 million for being a so-called Sandusky victim number 2, the Mike McQueary victim. Now, that's more than average for a Sandusky victim from Penn State, but here's where the key part is. His lawyer, according to the insurance documents, only took $700,000, which is way below market rate for such a situation. His lawyer, by the way, Andrew Shubin, a guy who represents 9 different Sandusky accusers, and oh, by the way, victim 2's mother used to work for him. My theory here is, Kevin, tell me if I'm crazy on this, my theory is that victim number 2 did not want to be part of this. That victim number 2 did not want to give any sort of story that was remotely different than what he gave the day Paterno was fired. He did not want to lie. He did not want to throw Jerry under the bus. But I believe his lawyer said to them, hey, look, you won't have to do anything. You let me take care of it. And by the way, I'll cut my rate as an extra incentive for you to go ahead and do this. You let me take care of all of it. No questions will be asked. You won't have to lie, and you're going to get a nice big check at the end of this. What do you think of that theory?
I think the theory makes sense given the evidence without a doubt, and if true, it would be grounds for disbarment.
Really?
If he is manufacturing a story, the lawyer, in order to gain financial benefit for a client who refuses to tell that version of the story, those are grounds for disbarment. He's lying to the court.
Well, see, but no, I guess you could. I have not. To be clear, I have not seen the insurance documents myself. I have spoken to someone who I have a great deal of trust in. Okay, highly credible source. I've seen some of the documents that prove that this is not a ridiculous story that I'm telling you here, okay? So I'm very confident that what I'm telling you is true. I'm trying to piece all this together as to why Shubin would take such a reduced rate on a case like this, and why the insurance company would have no. Oh, by the way, not only do they have no documentation from this particular victim himself, no story from him, no statement from him. The person from the insurance company was apparently shocked to hear that this person had given a statement on the day Joe Paterno had been fired saying nothing had happened. The insurance company had no knowledge of that, which is astonishing.
Well, let's go back here to something that's interesting to me. The three guys whose lives are on their line right now, their freedoms, Curly Schultz and Graham Spanier. All of that is predicated on some alleged cover-up from what we now know was a crime that never took place. The alleged victim says it didn't take place. The only alleged witness has changed his story a minimum of 4 times. The alleged victim in this purported crime was never asked to testify on behalf of the prosecution.
Right.
What kind of 3-ring circus in that courthouse up there allows for a conviction on any crime, but of course they didn't on his, but any related, I look at it as a tree of so many crimes with the branches going out, all based and flowing from this one alleged incident that didn't take place according to the 2 people that were there.
You said it tremendously well. I agree with everything you just said, but just for the record, here's what the other side has successfully been able to sell to the media. The other side has been able to say, well, we're not sure that this victim is the person in the shower that day, okay? And the reason why they're not sure is that we gave him a diagram. We asked him to diagram the shower, okay? So this would have been 10 years later. They give a kid, please diagram the shower.
I couldn't diagram my own shower today.
Right, exactly. Diagram the shower. By the way, where nothing happened. So it's not like it was even memorable. You took a shower with Jerry Sandusky. According to him, nothing happened. According to Jerry, nothing happened. By the way, their stories dovetail perfectly. And I'm, just for the record, Kevin, having investigated this more than anybody ever should have to, I am 1,000% positive that he was the kid in the shower. I mean, there's just absolute. It would take me an hour to prove it to you, beyond any shadow of a doubt.
Well, and no one else has ever come forward and said they were.
Exactly. So, that's the number one thing. No. So, in the most famous case in the history of child molestation in this country, worth millions of dollars, not only has no one come forward to say, "Wait a minute, it was me," but those who were creating this cover story knew that no one was going to come forward.
Right.
Hey, that was me. So it's impossible.
In addition to that, John, when you say that the other side says we're not convinced that he's the actual kid that was in the shower as victim number 2, let me tell you how convinced they would be if his story was that Sandusky was raping him. They'd be convinced he was the guy.
Exactly. And and by the way, further, there's so many little tidbits, but this is one of the funniest parts of this story that I think that this was one of the moment when I went, oh my gosh, I'm absolutely right about this. Famously, Governor Corbett of Pennsylvania was about to get shellacked in his reelection bid because of the story, and rightfully so. On the day after he leads Joe Paterno's firing, you may recall this, he says at a televised press conference, I told the Penn State Board of Trustees, remember the 10-year-old child, right? So he's referring to the boy in the McQuarrie episode. By the way, he wasn't 10 years old. He was almost 14 years old. He was 2 years short of winning a varsity letter in his high school football team. That's a totally different deal than a 10-year-old boy, right? So, but he says that publicly on television. 2 months later, in a local TV interview, Corbett denies ever having said it or having referenced the boy. Now, that's insane unless you have gotten new information. And the governor, I believe, got new information, which was don't hitch your wagon to the so-called 10-year-old boy, because the 10-year-old boy's story is far more complex and not keeping with our narrative. That's what I believe actually happened here. That's the only explanation for why the governor of the state of Pennsylvania denies having said something that he said in a nationally televised press conference.
It's unbelievable.
Unbelievable. The whole thing is unbelievable, but the problem is I am now being held, there's many problems, but I'm being held to a standard of proof here that literally God could not reach on all of this. So I'm at the mercy of this kid, or he's now 27 years old, finally coming forward and telling the real truth here. Dottie Sandusky believes that he eventually will. I am not as optimistic. My investigator thinks that he will eventually break. But even when it does happen, I'm sure the media will come up with some semblance of an excuse. The other excuse they'll probably try to come up with, and this would be the most hilarious scenario, Kevin. Here's what the most hilarious scenario would be. If the kid came forward and said, you know what, I was the kid, nothing happened, all that business, like they told the truth. Here's what the prosecution would hang their hat on. They would hang their hat on the notion that, well, maybe McQuarrie didn't see it, but said that he saw it, and that there was a cover-up of a crime that didn't actually happen. That's what I think they would try to hang their hat on. That's how incredibly insane this whole thing is.
Well, and not that I would ever think that the media would do the right thing, but it does amaze me that with all of this North Carolina stuff coming out today, that not one word in any of the coverage says anything to this effect. How in the world could the NCAA punish Penn State and yet not punish North Carolina to a much greater degree? And they don't even pose the question.
Well, we know why that is.
Of course we do, but it's amazing that they actually think that no one pays attention to that comparison.
Well, it is true. But here's the real reason. The real reason is that the Penn State story was a massive New Year's Eve party for the media, a party that no one paid for because they decided not to tell you what the truth was. So now the party is now over. They've gotten all their benefit from it. Now they want to pretend that party never existed because they don't want to pay the bill. And part of paying the bill on that party would be to use that precedent and that comparison to be consistent on other stories like this North Carolina situation. So they're never going to be consistent. They're going to forget that Penn State ever occurred. It happened in a vacuum in the media's mind because it's never to be used for any precedent-setting purposes in any shape or form, because if it is, they'll be exposed as the hypocrites that they are.
Great stuff as always. John Ziegler from FramingPaterno.com, and thank you for exposing that new bit of information regarding Victim 2, John.
Anytime, Kevin. Keep in touch.
You betcha. Thank you, John. All right, folks, this is the Pabst Blue Ribbon, Gateway Buick GMC Kings Court. I want to make sure I mention to you what Gateway Buick GMC has going on. They're at 270 McDonald Boulevard.